Welcome to Deakin Science and Society Network seminar for the stream Protecting and Restoring Australia's Environment and Transitioning to a Net Zero Future. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which each of us are here today. I would like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Let us pause to learn, acknowledge, and celebrate their ancient histories and cultures. My name is Ameeta, and I'm an Associate Professor of Property and Real Estate and the Co-Director of Principles of Responsible Management Portfolio at the Deakin Business School. My work spans property, finance, sustainability, public policy with a focus on strengthening community resilience as well as climate-ready housing. I work collaboratively with colleagues in finance, architecture, property, management, economics, and I also lead the home research group from the Faculty of Business and Law. The Science and Society Network was formed in 2018 in the recognition that scientists, humanities, and social sciences researchers need to work collaboratively together to meet the great challenges of this century. No single academic field can bring about the changes we need to see in this world. So bridging the disciplinary divides is the key to finding new solutions to the problems we face. The Science and Society Network supports early and mid-career researchers across the university who are embarking on groundbreaking interdisciplinary projects. For those who have not attended a seminar, an SSN seminar so far, a quick rundown of the structure for today's event is here. I'll introduce today's speaker, Dr. Evan Center. Dr. Center will present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have some discussant comments from Dr. Sudha Rafiq before we throw to general discussion, question and answers from the audience here as well as live streaming. I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Evan Center, who is the Head of Environment and Climate Change for the United Nations Global Compact Network Australia. This includes working with nearly 400 Australian cross-sectoral businesses and investors to drive progress towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and align with United Nations Global Compact's 10 principles. Evan directs private sector projects, thought leadership, policy engagement, and partnerships related to net zero, nature positive, and other important initiatives that support globally sustainable business engagement, including his work on sustainable finance, circular economy, just transition, and oceans. Evan holds a PhD in communication from the University of Kansas and has spent majority of his career at the nexus of enterprise, advocacy, and environment. Prior to working with the private sector, Evan utilized his research expertise to developing cutting-edge publications, programs, partnerships within the university, corporates, governments, and not-for-profit sectors. Evan also serves as a non-executive director on the board of Geelong Sustainability and is involved in a number of Australian initiatives that work towards net zero and nature positive progress. I'd like to now invite Evan to talk on the UN-Business Nexus and the evolution of global mechanisms for climate action. Evan.
It's good to be back. So in 1945, the newly sworn-in U.S. President Harry S. Truman offered a line that has lived for generations. If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace. In response to the Holocaust, and the atrocities therein in the Second World War, this quote emerged from an address that carried forth a vision of Truman's recently deceased predecessor, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Truman's address to the United Nations Conference in San Francisco carried forth this vision for global collaboration that, in his words, founded were founded upon justice and peace. It was a vision of multilateral discussion and decision-making in which, in Truman's words as well, we could not accept that might makes right, but instead we had to prove by our acts conclusively that right has might, because justice remains the greatest power on earth. It was a vision of a peaceful global order in which the responsibility of the great states is to serve and not dominate the peoples of the world. And 6 months later, on the 24th of October in 1945, just over a month after the official end of the Second World War, the UN was officially launched, a date now celebrated as UN Day. And at the Global Compact, we try to celebrate it with drinks and networking. Roosevelt's vision was carried forth by his widow, Eleanor. Truman appointed her as to the U.S. delegation to the first UN General Assembly held in London in 1946. She went on to chair the UN Commission on Human Rights and help draft and secure the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. More than 80 years on, the UN is still that platform, a place where every country, large or small, works through the greatest challenges of the day. Today, those challenges are many. They include the rise of AI and questions it raises about data privacy and labor rights, meaningful First Nations engagement, and the eradication of modern slavery at home and globally. We've heard some great announcements on that recently. And in the peace and the security side, ongoing conflict in which the UN Human Rights Council has characterized as acts of genocide. In my own role, working with the private sector, today's greatest global challenges look like extreme heat, bushfires, flooding, drought and water stress, sea level rise, coastal erosion, deforestation, marine impacts such as coral bleaching and ocean heat waves, waste and recycling, carbon offsets, and almost everything connected to the fossil fuel emissions that are rapidly narrowing the ability of humans to safely occupy this planet. Today, I want to spend some of our time on the relationship between the UN and the private sector and the impact that businesses can have here within it. An often used stat by the CBD suggests that just 100 fossil fuel producers are linked to more than 70% of global industrial greenhouse gas emissions since 1988, and businesses drive the majority of global investment and employment, which means that the Paris Agreement's goals depend not only on government ambition, but on private sector action at scale. Today, we'll trace the intersection of globalization, GDP, and the UN. We'll look at the historical development of international financial mechanisms that shaped country-level development, the rise of ESG, and the founding of the UN Global Compact, or hold on to your hats, we're going to use a lot of acronyms today, the UNGC. Maybe we'll play acronym bingo. You can just kind of shout out. I'll be like I6, and we'll see how we go. We'll see how the UNGC helped catalyze organizations and initiatives such as the PRI, SBTi, and dear to my heart, the PRME. We'll look at the private sector's growing role in global climate and nature negotiations. And we'll close on what Australian businesses need from the Global Compact today to drive net zero and nature positive progress, including what business is saying on energy security and climate policy, the expanding scope of climate-related financial disclosure, where Australia is positioned to play a global leadership role, including on Scope 3 assurance, and the skills that the private sector needs to carry this work forward. Together, these threads show how UN processes and private sector action are becoming ever more intertwined, and how important that combination is to driving climate solutions at scale. Alongside the UN system, a complicated but important body was born, the Economic and Social Council, or hold on to your acronym hats as well, the ECOSOC. And I'll be honest, I cannot remember why there are 3 extra acronyms or 3 extra letters there. I think it has something to do with the European Commission. But the ECOSOC is one of only 6 parts of the UN Charter, what they call an organ. Early on, the ECOSOC flagged the need for international statistical standards to support comparable economic policymaking across the disparate, war-shattered post-war economies. Australia was among the first countries to put integrated statistical reporting systems and formal national accounting structures in place. In 1953, a deliberately dry-titled document, which was 48 pages, called A System of National Accounts and Supporting Tables, gave the System of National Accounts, or the SNA, I6, its start. It set out this, I6 was just a bingo joke. There's not an actual I6 there. It set out 6 standard accounts and 12 supporting tables and became almost overnight the accepted method for standardizing that somewhat contentious concept that we now call GDP. The SNA was revised twice throughout the 1960s and again in the 1990s when the UN Statistical Commission wholly adopted the revised SNA, published it jointly by this time with the IMF, the OECD, the World Bank, and the European Commission. And this was a pivotal moment. For the first time, 5 of the world's most powerful economic institutions agreed on a single harmonized standard. GDP was now the global convention that every finance minister, credit rating agency, and news bulletin would reach for the answer to the question, how is the economy doing? While the concept of GDP counts production is far less accurate at describing who benefits from the production, what damage it does to things like the environment, or whether or not the institutions driving it are behaving responsibly. And by the 1990s, as globalization accelerated in an age of largely embroidered neoliberal policy, encouraged by deregulatory moves such as the repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act in the US, that silence on corporate impact beyond profit was becoming harder to ignore. The gap between unbridled economic growth and the social, environmental, and impact of corporations and investors who benefited from it is precisely the gap that UN Secretary General Kofi Annan stepped into. And on the 31st of January, 1999, while addressing the World Economic Forum in Davos, Annan told the assembled business leaders of the world that he was proposing something unprecedented. I propose to you, he said, the business leaders gathered in Davos, that we, the United Nations, initiate a global compact of shared values and principles, which will give a human face to the global market. And you can see that little photo plastered on our window up on Lygon Street if you want to come see us. You see Kofi? We're there. 18 months later, on the 26th of July, Annan turned that speech into an institution. The UN Global Compact launched at UN headquarters with nearly 50 pioneering companies organized around what would soon become the 10 principles covering human rights, labor standards, anti-corruption, and my area, environment. It was designed crucially as a voluntary, non-regulatory instrument. It was not a treaty. It was not a treaty that companies had to ratify, but instead it was a set of commitments that they chose to make and publicly report against. A quarter century later, the UN Global Compact is the largest corporate sustainability initiative in the world, with more than 20,000 participants across nearly 170 countries. The UN Global Compact's most consequential single contribution might be a 3-letter acronym it produced as almost an afterthought. In 2004, at Kofi Annan's invitation, 20 financial institutions from 9 countries, collectively managing more than $6 trillion at the time. That was a lot of money. They worked together with funding from the Swiss government and the process overseen by the UN Global Compact to produce a report titled "Who Cares Wins: Connecting the Financial Markets to the Changing World." That report is where the term environment, social, and governance, or ESG, first appears in print. Now, that wasn't the first instance of the conceptualization of ESG, but that was the first time we started calling it that. Its central argument was simple. Companies that manage environmental, social, and governance issues well are, all else equal, all factors the same, better because they manage risk better, they anticipate regulation earlier, and protect their reputations more effectively. What began as a recommendation to financial analysts to weigh 3 extra factors via those 3 letters into their models became within 2 decades a multi-trillion-dollar global industry and a term fought over in boardrooms and political campaigns alike. So when you hear Elon Musk say things like ESG is a scam or communism rebranded, you can blame the UN Global Compact. You can also politely thank him, amid his flaws and clear misunderstanding of ESG, for making EVs popular. When we take a look at the 3 contentious letters, we realize that in order to deliver on this idea, you need institutions to operationalize them. And over the following 2 decades, the UNGC gave rise to exactly those institutions. First, we have the PRI, now the largest, or the PRI, and that is the biggest of these organizations. It was launched in 2006 at the New York Stock Exchange through the UN Environment Program Finance Initiative, or UNFCCC, or UNEPFI, if you're still keeping with me on acronym bingo, and the UN Global Compact, or the UNGC, B8. check your cards. In the words of my friend and colleague Tom Wainwright, the UN Global Compact is the yin to PRI's yang. And while the UNGC was focused on corporate responsibility, the PRI gave institutional investors, pension funds, asset managers, insurers a voluntary framework for incorporating ESG factors into the investment decisions and their practice of ownership. It started as a promise backed by a handful of signatories. Now on the Global Compact's own account, it shapes the practice of investors managing upwards of $1 trillion in assets. Our own board chair in Australia at the UNGC, Fiona Reynolds, recognized as one of the most globally influential women in finance, was the CEO of the PRI that guided much of its incredible growth. Moving on to the PRME, and I've heard people say prime. I'm not sure if that's a common thing, but I never heard that before. But okay, good. All right. I'm seeing some head shakes. Not prime, PRME. I've always said PRME, so I guess I'm right. So in another chapter of my career, working on SDGs and work integrated learning curriculum here at Deakin, within Deakin International, I remember discussing SDGs, and I think if I remember correctly, PRME's blueprint for SDG integration in business schools with the brilliant Dr. Ameeta Jain. As you'd expect by now, the UN Global Compact and PRME go a long way back. In October 2006, at a forum on business as an agent of world benefit at Case Western Reserve University, the Global Compact's academic partners floated an idea. What if business schools committed to the same values as the companies their graduates will go on to run? A task force of 60 deans, university presidents, and academic leaders spent the following year drafting a set of principles. They were launched in 2007 at the Global Compact Leaders Summit in Geneva in the presence of the next UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who presided Kofi Annan as the Principles of Responsible Management Education, or PRME. The Principles of Responsible Management Education, according to then Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, has the capacity to take the case for university values and business into classrooms on every continent. PRME now sits as the UN Global Compact, its initiative for higher education, a comparable principles approach to integrating sustainable development. Today, it counts more than 800 signatory business schools across 90 countries, arguably the largest organized relationship between the United Nations and higher education anywhere in the world. A third outgrowth of the Global Compact, which I've had the pleasure of working with extensively, addresses private sector climate action directly. By 2015, within the Paris Agreement being negotiated and corporate climate pledges proliferating without any shared yardstick for what counts as credible, the Global Compact joined the CDP, the World Resources Institute, the WWF, and the We Mean Business Coalition to found the Science Based Targets Initiative, part of what we call the Global Commons Alliance. Its mandate was narrow and technical: translate the physics of a 1.5-degree pathway into emissions reduction targets that individual companies could actually set, and have those targets independently validated. A decade on, more than 11,000 companies and financial institutions engaged with the SBTi, and more than 10,000 have validated targets. Some of those have probably been violated as well. In Australia, we have run the Climate Ambition Accelerator for the last 4 years at the UNGCNA, another acronym, we'll touch on that shortly, which helps corporates set science-based targets with the SBTi as part of their own net zero transition strategies. Notice that these three institutions share a common bond. They're each specialized, they're voluntary, they're standard setting, and they're independent. The Global Compact launch put these aspects in every corner of the economy: investment, education, climate action, each one extending Kofi Annan's 1999 Davos proposition a little bit further into how the economy actually runs to benefit all. And then another initiative, which is dear to my heart, and I'm so sorry, Melburnians, for that Sydney background earlier. This is much better, in my opinion, although not as warm. This is the UN Global Compact Network, Australia, or the UNGCNA. As the head of environment and climate for the Global Compact, as Ameeta shared, we have a lot of organizations that we're working with, nearly 400 of Australia's leading cross-sectoral companies, alongside civil society and universities, of which we are involved with Deakin, to advance responsible business practice and the private sector's contribution to sustainable development. The UNGCNA leads, enables, and connects businesses and stakeholders to build a more sustainable future by encouraging responsible business conduct and identifying opportunities for positive impact through cutting-edge trading, thought leadership, practical guidance, and advocacy. And we'll dive into what that looks like in just a little bit. We are recognized as a trusted convener and advisor on responsible and sustainable business practice, and as a platform for organizations across Australia and Asia Pacific to connect, share knowledge, and drive those responsible business outcomes. Internally, we like to say we are very much a lighthouse organization. We illuminate a path that corporates can follow, both for positive impact, but also to increase their own long-term resilience. So let's talk a little bit more about what we do at the domestic and global level. In September 2015, 193 UN member states adopted what is termed as the 2030 Agenda and its 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And you'll notice here my SDG pen. They're hard to get, so I've got a couple extras if anyone wants them, and you could probably twist my arm, and I'll give them out. But there's more people in the audience, so you'll have to fight yourselves. A deliberately universal set of targets on poverty and inequality and climate, framed explicitly and somewhat unusually as a shared task for governments and business together. I used to have them memorized, but I'm not sure I still do, so please don't quiz me. But the UN Global Compact made the SDGs its own organizing framework almost immediately, branding its outreach to make companies of making global goals local business. So where does this 25 years of architecture leave us? For that answer, let's take a look at the 2025 UN Global Compact's Accenture CEO study, Turning the Key, which surveyed nearly 2,000 CEOs across 128 countries, with its headline providing a bit of a paradox. 88% of CEOs surveyed, as they probably would want to publicly say at the time of this survey, say that the business case for sustainability is stronger today than it was 5 years ago. 99% plan to maintain or expand their sustainability commitments, and 97% remain committed to the SDGs. And the study's 5 recommended priorities, collaborating on regulation, harnessing consumer demand, expanding across to technology, upskilling the workforce, and leading with credibility, read less like a new agenda than an update of Anand's 1999 proposition that markets, given the right shared values, can be made to serve people as much as they serve shareholders. CEOs, in other words, have not abandoned that project that was started in Davos. However, from what I've seen globally, they have become, at least a lot of those CEOs, have become quite a bit quieter about their sustainability commitments in public, wary oftentimes of political backlash. Green hushing is a term that we often deal with within our Global Compact network. And we oftentimes that quieting happens even though they keep investing in it privately. I would note that the Australian execs that I get to talk to on a regular basis have largely and somewhat surprisingly stayed the course in their public position on sustainability. And I think that says a lot about this incredible country. I would say, just as an aside, I had an interview by Accenture that's putting out another report on global compact networks, cool things that we're doing, and we'll talk about what that is. There was a little bit of surprise during that interview that I could source quotes from our companies on the good things that they were doing, because, based in the US, there's kind of a different environment of sustainable collaboration, right? And so our Australian companies, they're still standing pat, a lot of them that we're dealing with. Not all of them, but I'm quite surprised and quite happy about the momentum that we still have in sustainability here at what I would probably term lightly as a contentious geopolitical time. All right. Speaking of contention and geopolitics, let's transition to COP. Let's spend some time on what global and uniquely Australian business needs the Global Compact is serving today. And in doing so, we'll touch on COP to drive net zero and nature positive progress. We'll start with the global climate negotiations by the UNFCCC, and these are casually known as COP. Now, that COP acronym is a little bit confusing. There isn't just one COP, or the Conference of Parties. Through the climate negotiations, and in particular the Paris Agreement born out of COP21, are easily the most, or COP20, 20 or 21. Oh man, I'm getting my wires crossed. Are easily the most recognizable. It's just over 10 years since the Paris Agreement. Other COPs like the Biodiversity COP have also made headlines. So there's not just a climate COP. There's other COPs out there if you weren't aware. And especially when it's produced the Biodiversity COP, I believe it was just a few years, produced the Global Biodiversity Framework, the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which was the impetus behind other things like a subsequent Global Nature Positive Summit, which I was able to attend in Sydney in 2024. So there's some good things going on at the COPs, but today I'll mostly be discussing the climate action or the climate negotiations out of the UNFCCC's Conference of the Parties, and I will just be referring to it as COP. And as an aside, there's other COPs as well. If the multitude of COPs wasn't confusing enough, COP is quite our final boss, so to say, of acronyms, as the UN system likes to call pretty much everything a COP. Other COPs sit alongside communities of practice. We casually refer to them as a COP. And communication on progress, which I mentioned earlier, also called the COP. So all of these COPs can be quite confusing, but let's stick with the COP from the UNFCCC here. And I was able to attend this COP last year in Belém, Brazil, set in the Amazon rainforest, and it was absolutely extraordinary. Now, I'll note, I was a bit taken aback when I returned home to a persistent narrative of another failed COP. I had an interview, and I was shocked in that interview of the disappointment, right? You're jet lagged, you're coming back from a few days, and you've got a bit of a buzz, seeing a lot of cool things happen, and then all of a sudden COP catches fire, and then, Australia loses out on a bid, and we'll talk about that in a second. But you come back, and there's a bit of disjuncture between reports of the failed negotiation outcomes and kind of the excitement that can happen with COP. So let me describe COP in a little more detail and just kind of demystify that experience. At COP, there's a blue zone and a green zone. And here's a simplified layout. The blue zone is exclusive. It is where negotiations happens, and it also functions as a conference within the conference, with pavilions and side events and the latest moves towards a livable future climate. It has panels, speakers, celebrities, and the lot. The green zone, if you're not familiar, sits outside and is open to the public with more trade shows, business development opportunities, festivities, and a stronger party-like vibe. COP31 was super exciting, and Australia should be proud of what they pulled off there. The pavilion was amazing and wedged, and I'm pretty sure intentionally, in between the UNFCCC's pavilion and Turkey's pavilion. And the joke ongoing was UNFCCC did that so you all can sort it out. And I loved when I was there connecting, learning, swapping ideas, and tackling our climate problems, especially with other business professionals. And I saw the enormous value in that well outside of the contentiously reported failed negotiations, which obviously are much more important. Consensus building, though, it takes time. And without these failed negotiations, we wouldn't have outcomes like Brazil's COP-era commitments to better protect the Amazon rainforest as the lungs of the earth and support land rights for its active and outspoken indigenous groups. And as multilateral consensus building is hard, this doesn't mean that there's often no progress. Sometimes it's just especially difficult to get those big things done. Let's talk about a few of those big things in the lead up to COP31 in Turkey. In March of 2022, 175 nations at the UN Environment Assembly voted to create a legally binding treaty on plastic pollution, covering its full life cycle from production to disposal, negotiated through the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee, or the INC. Talks have unfortunately since stalled, but more than 250 companies, including big brand multinationals or MNEs like Nestle, Unilever, and PepsiCo, have joined the Business Coalition for a global plastics treaty. And essentially, the premise is that a single global standard is more cost efficient than working through a patchwork of state-based policies. As I was told last year by someone who helped negotiate the Paris Agreement, these things take time. It could be several more years or more before we see that final move towards progress. And even without a deal in place, here we can see businesses actively lobbying for regulation rather than resisting it. Large multinationals see regulatory certainty and a level playing field is worth more than a short-term cost of compliance. One recent more encouraging outcome concluded in 2023 under the UNCLOS, the Biodiversity National Jurisdiction Agreement, or BBNJ as it's casually called for short, in case you're looking for another acronym. This is the first international agreement governing roughly 60% of the ocean beyond national jurisdiction, covering marine genetic resource benefit sharing, high seas marine protected areas, and mandatory environmental impact assessments and technology transfer to developing nations. As of April 26, it is in the ratification phase, needing only 60 states to enter into force, and the Pacific Island nations are the most vocal and pushing for speed. Fishing, shipping, deep sea mining, and bioprospecting industries were engaged throughout the negotiations, and the treaty is also conceptually and operationally linked to the plastics treaty that I mentioned above. Since ocean plastic pollution and marine diversity loss will need to be coordinated for implementation. Unlike the plastics treaty, though, this is less about business lobbying for a deal and more about direct commercial exposure. Industries operating under the high seas were parties to the negotiation because the treaty determines who can commercialize resources found in international waters. Finally, recently, in Santa Marta, Colombia, and co-hosted by Colombia and the Netherlands, the first conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels is the first standalone conference dedicated to this actual phasing out process. Santa Marta itself is symbolic, chosen as a major coal export port, and the conference brought 60 governments, plus subnational governments, civil society, and private sector representatives running outside of the formal UNFCCC process to build what they are calling a mini-lateral, and what has been called in the past a mini-lateral coalition, to reinforce net zero language in the negotiations. Now, this is interesting because this came as a direct result from COP30, and it is about the language that Russia and the Arab States Group and others had pushed to water down at COP30, stripping transition away from fossil fuels out of the final text. So watch this space at COP31 as fossil fuel policy fragments into parallel tracks. I would expect more discourse around companies exposed, especially in this petrostates versus electrostates space, and the urgency there to phase out coal, oil, and gas more broadly, especially with our economic crisis, are coming with gas marketplace shocks that many industries are facing outside of the fossil fuels. And we can talk about that more in a little bit. Last year at COP30, amid fires, extreme heat, heated negotiations, and a groundswell of support for Australia and the Pacific to host the COP31 in Adelaide, a significant announcement is made. And as you'll notice by our graphic up here, it is not being hosted in Adelaide this year. After extensive closed-door negotiations in Australia, which had been expected to be and primed to be the host at COP31, and it was really funny watching everyone come away from panels saying, "See you in Adelaide, see you next year in Adelaide," and it was just this whole rhetoric coming through. And then, unfortunately, everyone was a bit crushed, and they agreed. Australia agreed to Turkey's bid to host in the Mediterranean city of Antalya, on the condition that Australia's negotiating team would preside as president of the global climate negotiations this year. And I'm not going to lie, as I mentioned, me and nearly everyone else with Australian ties at COP30, and much further than that, had World Cup level disappointment, as I call it. And I'm not even just talking about Australia exiting early. Like, people were crushed. This is like England level World Cup disappointment, right? Or maybe even Argentinian. Sorry, soccer jokes. But yeah. I'm not, but amid that disappointment, informal discussions with counterparts in Turkey and elsewhere suggested this could be the largest COP ever held, and some are already positioning it as the COP of business. Business support has mattered to the success of previous COPs, and it is expected very much to matter again. And I know I can see some of your reactions. That seems like a terrifying thing, but I want to look at the optimistic side of that as well. A climate COP's success is generally measured by its ability to deliver substantial global agreements that move climate action forward. COP3 in Kyoto, COP21 in Paris, and COP26 in Glasgow each produced landmark outcomes that stand as examples of effective international climate diplomacy, and private sector engagement played a critical role in each. COP21 and COP26 in particular showed how private sector initiatives can drive ambitious outcomes. In the lead up to Paris, the French business community built momentum and demonstrated commitment to a low carbon economy. 39 influential French companies pledged to invest at least 45 billion euros over 5 5 years from 2016 to 2020 in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and other low-carbon technologies through the French Business Climate Pledge. French businesses were also active in initiatives like the UN Global Compact's Caring for Climate and the Lima Paris Action Agenda. The UK's financial sector played a similarly prominent role in COP26 in Glasgow, mobilizing green finance for climate action. The Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ for short, GFANZ, co-chaired at the time by the now Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, brought together financial institutions with more than 130 trillion in assets under management committed to this net zero transition. And these platforms let companies showcase climate solutions and foster dialogue between the private sector and policymakers. And as a quick flex, thanks to our board chair, I got to chat with Mark Carney's team in 2024 to get him to speak at our conference, and they politely declined. Apparently, running for Prime Minister of Canada was far more important than our conference. I'm not hurt. Notably, Mark Carney's experience as the first non-Brit to serve as governor for the Bank of England positioned him quite well to facilitate the types of private sector leadership that matters for mobilizing climate finance. Others have followed suit. At COP29 in Baku, often called a failed COP, parties agreed to the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, the NCQG, tripling finance to developing countries to US $300 billion annually by 2035, and committing nations to scale up finance by 1.3 trillion US dollars a year by 2035 as well. By showcasing progress, scaling solutions, and rallying support for global climate action, SDG 13, I know that one. The Australian private sector has real potential to drive impact on the global stage. Domestically, Australia's commitment to world-leading climate reporting, rapidly accelerating electrification, and an emerging nature repair market all present opportunities to showcase private sector leadership for a successful COP. Indeed, this year we are taking inspiration from COP21 and COP26. The Australian private sector indeed has this opportunity to rally behind initiatives that boost our domestic economy, showcase Australian leadership, and both drive domestic and global climate action. Accordingly, Australian businesses and investors have a key role to play in delivering these targets and supporting climate-resilient development, particularly in our region where SDG financing gaps remain especially acute. At the UNGCNA, we're also working hard, go back to our COP slide, to drive a successful COP31 through the private sector engagement. In May of 26, we convened almost 400 directors, executives, and sustainability leaders from across the Australian private sector to explore how businesses can support a successful COP31 through the negotiations and implementation sides of COP. Here are some of the themes that came out from those conversations, which we're feeding back to government as well. Climate risk is economic risk, and transition is very much a growth opportunity. Business leaders consistently frame climate change as a material financial risk affecting asset values, productivity, supply chains, insurance availability, and long-term competitiveness. The net zero transition was positioned not as a compliance exercise, but as an opportunity to strengthen resilience, improve energy security, and unlock new economic value. Key COP31 implications include accelerating renewable energy deployment, electrification, industrial decarbonization, and investment in emerging low-carbon industries such as green iron. Participants emphasize the need for boards and investors to integrate climate risk into core strategy, governance, and capital allocation decisions. COP31.2 must focus on implementation, policy certainty, and investment. A dominant theme at the conference was a shift from commitments to delivery. Achieving national and global climate goals requires stable long-term policy settings that give private investment confidence. Policy certainty and credible transition pathways were seen as essential to unlocking investment at scale. Businesses called for clear and deliverable policy signals aligned with national climate targets, greater mobilization of private capital through blended finance and de-risking mechanisms, increased investment flows to developing economies in the Pacific, stronger business advocacy for ambitious climate action and implementation, and a growing recognition that non-fossil fuel sectors are also exposed to energy market fluctuations, making energy security a shared priority. Theme 3, climate disclosures should drive decisions, not reporting burden. Australia's first year of mandatory climate-related financial disclosure was widely viewed as a strategic opportunity rather than a compliance requirement. I want to talk more about this in a bit. Participants highlighted the greatest value of reporting as improving board oversight and accountability, embedding climate considerations into strategic planning and investment decisions, strengthening capital allocation and risk management, and enhancing the credibility of transition plans. For COP31, effective disclosure frameworks were seen as an critical infrastructure for directing capital towards resilient, low emissions outcomes while improving market transparency and accountability. Theme 4 was climate and nature and people. That social side must all be addressed together. Businesses increasingly recognize that climate, biodiversity, water, human rights, and social outcomes are interconnected and cannot be managed in isolation. Discussion highlighted growing recognition of nature risk as business risk, the importance of place-based approaches tailored to local conditions, meaningful engagement with First Nations communities, and respect for free, prior, and informed consent, and the need for just transition planning that supports workers and communities as well. Participants argued that successful climate action depends on building social license through genuine partnership and ensuring communities benefit from transition outcomes. Partnership and communication are critical enablers. Cross-sectoral collaboration emerged as a defining requirement for successful climate action. And our fourth theme, businesses, governments, civil society, First Nations groups, and local communities were brought together, and there's the realization that they each have a role in delivering these climate and resilience outcomes. A significant capability gap identified was communication. Climate action is often communicated in technical language rather than tangible economic and social benefit. I would also add it is also communicated in acronyms. And businesses and policymakers are encouraged to better articulate, better communicate how climate action can improve energy security, reduce costs over time, increase competitiveness, and create jobs and strengthen communities. For COP31, the most effective storytelling and public engagement will be critical to sustaining support for ambitious business implementation. And theme 6, AI can support but not replace human-centered transition efforts. AI was viewed primarily as a productivity, governance, and workforce tool, capable of improving sustainability data management, reporting, value chain analysis, and strategic decision-making. Participants stressed, however, that successful transition will still continue to rely on human leadership, stakeholder engagement, workforce development, and compelling, again, communication. And that, as with the energy transition itself, AI deployment should support an equitable and inclusive transition for workers and communities. Mapped against the COP31 action agenda, the business community's priorities for a successful COP31 can be summarized as treating climate risk as economic risk, moving from commitments to implementation, mobilizing large-scale public and private finance, strengthening climate disclosure and transition planning, integrating climate, nature, and social outcomes, advancing just transition outcomes, deepening cross-sector partnerships, and improving communication of climate action's benefits. Together, these priorities position COP31 as a COP very much focused on implementation, focused on translating ambition into measurable economic, social, and environmental outcomes as we get back to our ESG acronym. We've also had the privilege of hosting roundtables over this last year or so for corporate executive and institutional investor leadership, which have surfaced a few interesting insights from Australian businesses. The first was held at the ASX headquarters in Sydney almost a year ago today, where we were simultaneously launching our sustainability reporting community of practice. Whole different COP acronym, by the way. We call it the SRCOP, which is going to get really confusing now. But we had over 100 CEOs and executives in the room and selected 30 of them for an actual roundtable to discuss NDC uplift. I was particularly proud of that first session since we brought in UNFCCC Executive Secretary Simon Steele, the boss of COP, so to speak, and different COP, the main COP, for a keynote and for a Chatham House rule discussion on that NDC uplift that I mentioned. And a few of my favorite Chatham House takeaways from the session were also, I'll loop them into our second session. We followed that up with another session with PRI, where we brought investors and corporate executives together in Melbourne. We had PRI's CEO at the time, David Atkin, come out, and we had some really, really good discussions on kind of ESG frameworks and how corporates and investors can better work together to advance net zero nature positive progress. I have about 7 quick hits from those conversations. I found them really, really interesting. First, strong cross-sectoral alignment was there that suggested that 1.5 to 2 C's that Paris Agreement aim is indeed best for business. Businesses, corporates, and investors, like predictability. Getting nature and biodiversity right together is imperative to decarbonization. That was another theme that came through. NDCs can serve as a guiding North Star and a material factor for investors. One of my favorite quotes, instead of talking about renewables, we should just simply be talking in a marketing sense about cheap energy. That was a really good quote from a really influential person. I loved it. There is an urgent need to align emissions reduction efforts with the real economy. The framework exists and the focus must now shift to implementation and delivery. A lot of focus from business on delivery. Businesses need support to ensure they aren't penalized for their own net zero nature positive ambition. Clear government timelines and infrastructure to mobilize private sector effort while protecting individual businesses from regulatory exposure is important. There is a recognition that the global economy has made real progress on decarbonization in the decades since the Paris Agreement. I thought that was just nice to talk about because most of the time in my job, and let's be honest, most of us, or if you're like me, you unfortunately end up doom scrolling through news before you go to bed, and you see a lot of disparaging things. But when you really talk about progress that has been made against all odds, that needle moves slowly, it takes a lot of effort, but it is not enough. But it is nice to see that it's happening. And then there was my personal favorite on somewhat of a vindictive note. Businesses are concerned about misinformation campaigns that undermine growing business support for and the economic opportunity tied to an ambitious Australian NDC. And one of the participants said, and I paraphrase, businesses are sick and tired of having a single peak body, and you know who they are, represent Australian business while intentionally steering the conversation away from action on climate, nature, and biodiversity. This was a high-level executive really upset, and I suspect that they were talking about the methodologically flawed McKinsey report that the BCA put out last year. Bringing these notes back to our SRCOP, or Sustainability Reporting Community of Practice, at the local level, beyond just holding these discussion forums, there's actually some implementation happening. We are helping businesses work on something very powerful right now, the intersection, and I know it sounds boring, but at the intersection of two of what I would argue are the biggest levers for corporate change, and those are regulatory policy and capital. And this is the Sustainability Reporting Community of Practice. This is where it gets a little bit more confusing in that acronym space, but we're switching from COP to SRCOP. So different COP, more acronyms, but we're rounding out towards the end. If you're not familiar with mandatory climate-related financial disclosure, and I'm seeing CFRD if you want another acronym to throw in there, emerge, but I like to just simply call it climate reporting, as it's known quite often here in Australia. This is the first year businesses, or the larger businesses, have essentially had to disclose their environmental impact. Climate reporting is a genuinely dry subject to talk about, but it actually might change the world. As I just mentioned, there are two levers that drive corporate climate change: regulatory policy and capital. Simply put, corporates need financial flows of capital expenditure to keep their gears turning. And the organizations are subject to government regulatory requirements. Climate reporting pulls both of those levers at once and puts responsibility for the climate report at the highest level of the organization, the board of directors. Climate, or at least here in Australia. Climate reporting provides this rare moment where investors, governments, and activists can all align. Investors use reporting to assess climate risk, compare like with like, or apples to apples, so to speak. Governments increasingly need transparency to understand private impact and align with the Paris Agreement's goals. And even environmental activists, who are dear to my heart, although I often work on both sides of the spectrum, can use climate reporting to hold corporations to account. It is generally a surprising turn of events where accountants and lawyers that don't always like each other are now working together with sustainability professionals to provide exactly this kind of corporate transparency that has real potential to assist climate mitigation and adaptation efforts. And climate reporting isn't just this, and climate reporting is indeed just the start. Corporations will need to build a cross-team capacity and capability to incorporate nature reporting, climate's counterpart, and in time, social reporting as well. Reporting is a crucial step in our net zero nature positive transition. And at the Global Compact Network in Australia, we are helping lead this world leading sustainability reporting community practice, or SRCOP, to help businesses through it. And you can see a few things from these slides. We've got a lot of really cool businesses that we're working with. This is just a handful. We've got over 100 in there. And when we work through, we have a number of topics that we're working through, but every time we kind of bring the space together where organizations, bigger organizations, smaller organizations that are now starting to have to report, and they can work through the trickiness of this. We've had 200 years of financial reporting for accountants. We've obviously seen some of that shift change since the 1960s, but really we're building the plane as we fly here on sustainability reporting. But I really believe in mandatory climate-related financial disclosure, and our businesses are picking it up, and we're seeing a lot of different parts of the business really understand what climate reporting can teach them about their own business, about their own risks, about their own resilience, and using climate reporting not just as a compliance exercise, but as a value creation opportunity to capture market share and to drive long-term value through their business. None of this happens, though, without people. Net zero and nature positive outcomes aren't delivered by frameworks, standards, or disclosures. They're delivered by people with the skills to interpret them, implement them, and turn them into action. I was privileged to have a chat a little while back with the University of Southern California on a topic of how they could prepare students better for sustainability careers. I mentioned that there are an array of skills that businesses need, so students listening in on this presentation, this is for you. Everything from policy expertise to life cycle assessment skills to engineering to accounting to ecology to qualitative and quantitative data management are very, very important. Likewise, I've had our interns come through with business, marketing, and ecology and other backgrounds. Notably, we just had one of our many fantastic interns come through who helped me a lot on this presentation as well. Our fantastic intern, Pooja Talakar, who's helped me extensively and now is gainfully employed with a fantastic job right out of her internship, even though I don't think she's graduated from Deacon's own CB school. Now, CB school, department, oh man, I'm messing it up. School. All right, it's been a while. However, the landscape is shifting rapidly. Obviously, AI is overhauling what our future careers will look like. But accountants right here and now are indeed actually like superheroes saving the world. And at our recent conference, business execs were remarking that it wasn't accounting, it wasn't the lawyers that are working on the compliance side of reporting, but it was communication and critical thinking that were the most important skills that they're needing to produce corporate impact with sustainability. In other words, we need business majors, engineers, lawyers, accountants, all to work with communication professionals to be able to tell the story of sustainability, and not just to the public, but to work with narratives involved in corporate sustainability reporting, to be able to shape impact through management teams, to market impactful products, and get buy-in from executive teams and the board. This may be my own comms background coming through, but never underestimate the ability to tell a story with impact. I'm a strong believer that corporations are not people. Legally, there's kind of more of a gray area, but corporations, in my mind, are not people. They are run by people. And as people, we are often driven by our capacity to embrace narratives. So students here today, students listening in, put yourself in the place to shape those sustainability narratives for good. In conclusion, in 1945, Harry Truman stood before the world with emerging catastrophe and argued that humanity faced this very simple choice: learn to live together in peace or perish together in conflict. 80 years later, the defining challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, resource insecurity, and growing inequality cannot be solved by governments alone. Today, we have traced the evolution of the United Nations from post-war institution building to deep engagement with businesses throughout the UN Global Compact, the PRI, the PRME, and the SBTi. We've seen how global agreements increasingly depend on private sector action, investment, and innovation. And Australia now has the opportunity to demonstrate leadership through climate disclosure, clean energy development, nature positive action, and support for successful COP31 outcomes in Antalya, Turkey. If the 20th century was defined by building institutions capable of keeping the peace, I would suggest that the 21st may be well defined by whether or not we can work together across sectors, borders, and generations to build a net zero, nature positive, and genuinely sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Evan, for a very brilliant presentation. You did it so nicely in a chronological order, and I've learned a lot myself. Thank you so much for that. Now, I'd like to invite my colleague, Dr. Sudha Rafiq, as a discussant for today. So, Sudha and Evan, would you like to please come here? I'd like to just introduce Sudha. Sudha specializes in sustainability issues at the intersection of energy, environment, and climate. He's very successfully led externally funded projects supported by organizations such as the World Bank, Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, and the Australian Bureau of Statistics. His research has attracted substantial media attention across Australia, Indonesia, Bangladesh, and contributed to public policy building in these countries. At Deakin, he coordinates undergraduate units, including business and climate change and energy, environment, sustainability, as well as postgraduate units in creating value for sustainable business practices. Thank you, Sudha, for your time today. So let's go to some questions. I'm sure the audience has a number of questions, and I certainly do for Evan, but I think I'll start with the audience first. Any questions, please?
Is there a dictionary for the acronyms?
Oh, yeah. I think my first week, my boss at the time, she was like, yeah, she was like, stop us when we use acronyms. Everyone stop using acronyms. Those are awesome.
Thank you.
Start with a couple of questions. Oh, should we use the mic for the recording? Oh, okay.
The room picks up the.
I just had two questions. One, in relation to you were talking about investors and consumers, and I think there has been some hope over the last couple of decades that consumers want businesses and products to be sustainable, and that investors, will favour like ethical investments or things that are labelled that way. And there's been, as you mentioned, these concerns about greenwashing, kind of scepticism about that whole sector. So I just, was curious how you thought the whole consumers, investors part of it. Is that holding up, or do we just focus on, regulation and governmental and not really worry about the consumers?
Those are three of my favorite topics, probably, to be a nerd about a little bit, at least from when we talk to our businesses, right? The consumer side, the investor side, and the greenwashing side. And I think we could go deeper on the greenwashing side, and I think we could set the investor side a bit for a little bit, because I think investors are very focused on financial materiality a lot of times, and they're looking for long-term resilience. So I think that's an interesting conversation there. The greenwashing side often dives into the consumer side. You'll see the regulatory side on that with the ACCC and looking at consumer behavior. We've also seen the investor side be targeted. I think it was Vanguard got hit with a massive fine not too long ago for greenwashing. Greenwashing litigation kind of, I find simply to explain it, like kind of at a student level, right? You have greenwashing where your organization is responsible for saying something that is accurate. And then you kind of have the branded greenwashing where people are like, I don't feel like they're actually saying that, right? But you have the actual legal side, and boards are very much liable for greenwashing through climate reporting. But if we get to the consumer side, right, I think there's a part of me while writing my dissertation that I became increasingly frustrated that we often target consumer behavior for climate impact. And I think there's a point. I remember last year, my favorite coffee shop in Geelong, the Local, is my local, and I forgot my keep cup, right? And so I was like, oh no, forgot my keep cup. I'm gonna have to drink out of cardboard, and I'm gonna have a not very recyclable cup that we think is recyclable, but and it's not great with the plastic top. And I was like, oh man, why am I feeling all this guilt? I'm not gonna go back home. I'm just gonna get my coffee. Why can't we create a bigger change, right? Why do we keep on putting the responsibility for climate action on the consumer rather than changing corporate behavior? I think we're going to be much more effective by looking at corporations and how we can shape corporate behavior than we are going to be at looking at, billions of consumers, right? It's a harder way to manage things than have thousands of corporations versus billions of consumers, right? So I think our biggest impact, if we can put a lot more resourcing towards changing that corporate behavior, we can look at policy, advocacy, other things, investor changes to corporate behavior. You can look at active, like proxy investors. Some of our super funds have shown the ability to change corporations. So that corporate change, I think, is where we can see the biggest and most immediate impact on environment. And while Australia probably doesn't have the best reputation, I see a lot of momentum happening with corporations here on being able to de-risk themselves from a lot of geopolitical situations, and especially energy marketplace exposure recently, and being able to really focus on their own changes. And that's not necessarily consumer driven, right? So I think that consumer activism side is much more accessible to me and a lot of people. But I think we see faster and bigger change through actually making the corporations do the changing rather than the consumer activist side. So that's my opinion. Yeah.
That's great.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm not very good at synonyms. Those stuff and acronyms and those things. I'm an academician and I do research. So right now I was talking with Ameeta. Right now I'm running two projects with one in Chinese context, another in US context. So let me start with Chinese context.
Poised to me when you said US context. I felt really comfortable.
I'm coming to Teddy and Eleanor's country a little bit later. Let me start with China. Okay. In the first one, what I'm doing is in 2016, China implemented a emission reduction policy across its, coastal belt. Okay, so all the shipbuilding industry. So what we are trying to see that how that impacted corporate ESG and corporate commitments, right? So certainly these guys know that, so I'm not gonna get into too much, statistics and those things analysis. You can just take it from me. What we did is gold standard science, economic science. What we found out is that yes, these companies, and we took all A-listed Chinese companies. And what we essentially found out is all these companies have actually invested. The moment that particular emission reduction thing kicked in, companies started investing in environment, governance. They have started, doing advocacy with Chinese Communist Party more, just to make. However, at the cost of social indicators, especially, we have seen huge inequality in salaries. So they are not compensating their mid and lower level employees, and they are the ones who are getting hurt as companies are multitasking, since these guys are multitaskers. So they are just shifting some money from one place to another to look good, as that's one study. With US, we have found out similar type, like that in US, that is more about climate lobbying. So we are looking at 1.5 million documents of lobbying in US houses and all those. And we have found a similar type of thing that companies, like what we are doing is we are looking at post-disaster, post-hurricane lobbying of all the companies. And we have seen that companies actually intentionally increase, after disaster, they intentionally increase lobbying Republicans rather than Democrats, with a view that if Democrats win, they are gonna put more pro-climate policies, which can hurt. So what do you think about that? Like companies making strategic choices?
Yeah,
and
I think when I was thinking, obviously corporate lobbying is a big issue. I find that often in my experience, I've seen companies not directly lobby, or if they do, it's very quiet, but they often go through their peak body association groups, right? To produce those lobby to to push for their own interests. And I think that McKinsey report last year was an excellent example of this, right? But I also see, there's a long tradition of naming and shaming companies for their lobbying efforts. And it has produced change. That's not something that's as much a part of my job, but you really see some organizations like Influence Map. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but fantastic tool that will show you the peak bodies and a number of other corporations and where they stand. Everyone can go through there. I think to get more into the nitty gritty, you probably need a subscription, but Influence Map, I've been very impressed with their efforts. So and I've seen other things through my own experiences. But yeah, the lobbying efforts post-climate disaster is something that's probably new to me. I actually did a study down with Hurricane Katrina victims back, dating myself quite a bit early on in my graduate studies. And, we definitely saw Bush at the time and a lot of backlash with how he deployed FEMA for Hurricane Katrina victims. But when you talk to the people that were most impacted, they were like, you know what, most of this is fine, but we're caught up in the middle of a political discourse. And I think that's probably the bigger problem that we see. Coming back to the consumers and the people that are actually affected, we often get caught up in this political discourse. It would be nice to push for more policy and advocacy and support those businesses so that they can see their own business resilience, lower their own risks, and not have to go through these back channeling kind of efforts to, maybe impact us in not the best way. So, and we are seeing that with a lot of our businesses.
And actually the advocacies and communication stuff that you guys are doing, I think that matters a lot. That actually, pushes company into doing something really concrete and making the real change.
China's surprising us all right now. They're really dominating, this electrification kind of market. I don't know if that's probably the best way to put it, but they're doing great. So I mean, I think an optimistic kind of perspective could be really helpful amidst the doom and gloom of climate action and back channeling via lobbying.
Another thing I think that's very important is inequality. So as we certainly, it's companies as well as increasing global governments are increasingly subsidizing renewables and accelerating energy transition. In this process, we have to mindful about that we don't actually do it at the cost of increasing inequality in the society. So when I'm subsidizing EVs or solar panels, then I have to also, like a great example is US weatherization program. So whom do you target? So weatherization, I'm a very big fan of US weatherization program because they target those low income communities.
And I mean, I'll tell you what, I grew up in cold weather climate in the US and the winter stays outside for the most part. It's really nice. But living in Geelong, we just got a new house and I can't afford to do all the things right away. You buy a new house and you're like, oh, now we have the weatherproof it. And the winter comes inside. I'm cold. So seeing that kind of policy, Geelong Sustainability is doing a lot of work. They have some cool things like climate safe rooms where they can help people in poverty, escape heat. This is much more your area.
I had a project with Geelong Sustainability 2 years ago.
Oh yeah,
they're doing amazing work.
So, and thanks to you, probably. So
no. I'm just on the periphery, but they are on top of it. They're doing amazing work.
So I would love to see that more. It's kind of, we see a lot of chicken egg scenarios. Is it better to help the people directly? Is it better to for things, help industrial decarbonization accelerate, right? Do we work through a diesel rebate tax? Like, what are the bigger things to solve emissions, or can we channel money to help people? I'm not sure what we're in a tough spot and those are tough questions that we're gonna have to figure out.
These conversations always trigger me. I keep coming.
They should.
So I'm from New York City, Wall Street dinosaur, don't judge me. I'm director of the National Board of the Australian Institute of Energy for 10 years, and I'm now secretary of the World Energy Council in Australia. And
I'm glad we're not
judging-
debating.
Judging the Banksy Foundation Sustainability Awards for 9 years.
Oh,
Grass says hi, she was.
Yeah, yeah. I was
she'd
just
like
gonna say,
she'd
Grass
like
is
to be here.
epic. Yeah. One of my favorite people.
And so I came over here to mind my own business, but got stuck into a carbon company when I moved here back in 2009. And they wanted me to do all this trading of certificates, going to create certificates.
Political kryptonite.
And I said, well, you know, I'm a guy from Wall Street, so I know how to manipulate things. But I said, until you make 1 ton of something you can't see, taste, or smell, an internationally fungible commodity, I'm not trading anything. So
Yeah.
we pivoted to a carbon accounting company.
Oh,
Embodied, embedded, soil, all of it.
Yeah.
Consulting to Anger, CPRS, done.
yeah.
$6 million carbon company. We're gonna link with the UK market. Tony Abbott gets elected. So, doctor, I have a lot of time for you, but I never hear anybody say carbon price. That gets rid of all of this reporting minutia, 200 years of accounting and spending. We know how to report. It's not even interesting.
Yeah.
It's a
It's
waste
super
of
boring.
time unless there's action at the end of it. There's a
100%.
transaction, and the only place adults deal with things if it's on the balance sheet,
Mhm.
not over here in this. I love how they call them schemes in Australia. It doesn't even sound legitimate. It's a program. You want a program? Let's do a scheme. Come up with that. That's not the scheme. Can't we just have a carbon price?
First off, as another American in the room, I was shocked when I had my first scheme that I benefited from, and I was like, "Oh, we got to get more schemes. These are awesome." I love scheming.
I'm a wise guy a bit, obviously, but seriously.
Yeah.
That's where things get dealt with, and everything else is
Yeah.
over here, and lobbying, and special
Yeah.
funds, and the governments and everything.
Yeah.
But there's no markets in Australia. The government's in everything.
Oh, yeah. It is really interesting to see government involved.
So you just put a commodity on the balance sheet, it gets
Yeah.
dealt with. Or not. I mean, you make a choice, but it's on the
Yeah.
balance sheet, it's transparent theoretically. The board gets to see it. That's where the risk lies.
Yeah.
You deal with it.
This is a phrase that I often hear, I'll put nature on the balance sheet, right? Like, and I think there's kind of a debate that happens within the ESG community, where you kind of have this impact investing side, and I'm saying this like because I'm sitting up here, we should probably switch seats, but you know, right, you have this a lot of discussions around double materiality, impact investing, but there's also just real risk. Like there's real financial risk tied, you put it on the balance sheet. This is the language that you have to learn if you want to communicate and make change with corporations, right? So you're not, from my perspective, I don't see a lot of conversations going too far, especially anymore, around kind of the ethical side of corporate responsibility. I'm still a strong believer that corporates are not people, they're made up of people, right? And so we can look at those people, and those people have to make decisions. They're often
Just
judged on their
opinions
ability
and
to make.
emotions, right? We're animals.
Yeah.
You put a commodity on the balance sheet, you deal with it.
Exactly. You put it on the balance sheet, you show the risk, things change.
You know, and I'm sick of talking to sustainability managers who are marketing people. You know, I mean, really, we're not
nearly-
dealing with this like adults.
We nearly got
Yeah.
there in Australia. What year was it? When
2012.
Turnbull
2012.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
Green
It was
voted
repealed.
against it, and yeah,
Oh,
it would be different.
killing the good for the best or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, as an academician, so I have to go to my undergrads every single trimester, right, and show them carbon pricing, so abatement and damage. And that the question that you have, asked, that's the golden question they all come about. And the moment I show them that those two graphs of carbon supply and the only thing that they say that this should solve everything, and that's why I just pointed out that inequality, because while I discuss with those curves, I tell them that see, this is the most just and most cost-effective method of tackling emissions. There is no other way. So whatever else we are talking about, we are just picking up. Because and in economics, we call them second best work. So we are all playing in, and thanks to contagious positivism from, people like events, because still they are fighting, with the second best word, because we all know that, due to conflict, due to, rent-seeking behavior, politics, and all those things in the
Three-year election
background,
cycles.
we cannot, even if we all know that that's the first best alternative, we are not playing with the first best alternative.
I think on the flip side, I do wonder about organizations, especially in the US, right? One of my good friends works for some, financial advisory firm, probably doing some terrible things. I know for a fact he is. But I grew up with him. He makes a lot more money than I'll probably ever make. And he, we were talking. He was like, "You know what? I don't mind anything, but I hate. Excuse my language, but these are his words. All this woke ESG bullshit." And I was like, "Fair enough. If we're looking at it from an ethical imperative for corporates, but why would you ignore the utility of seeing where some of your risks are at because you're buying into a political ideology about climate change that maybe is very much not scientifically backed, and by maybe it's definitely not. And so why not ignore some of the flip side of the political side and actually look at the numbers, right? Like, can't you de-risk some of where your capital allocation flows are going? Like, can't you do that? And I think that was a conversation that we had where I often see people that are in that spot, caught up in a flip side of this discourse that is very ideological rather than just kind of looking at the balance sheet.
Well, I mean, it's multiple things as usual. There's never one, except the carbon price is a bit of a silver bullet. The quality of board members around the place. And again, I'm sorry I'm from out of town. I'm not preaching from America because that's a bit of a dumpster fire. But the quality of board members around the place. I mean, you said climate to them. What does that mean? What line of the balance sheet is that on? Like, they don't even know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So as much as I obviously
They're learning.
you have to speak the right language of things.
Yeah.
Nobody cares. Polar bears are not on the balance sheet.
Yeah.
Like, they don't. That's not a thing.
Right now, the boards are being forced to learn. Like in Australia, I mean, you know as well.
It's 2026.
Yeah.
The amount of time we burn on this.
Probably not 10 years before we get to.
Another thing I was, I'm very intrigued to know from you is we have got an excellent policy of, future made in Australia.
Yeah.
Which is built on our, metal and mineral richness.
Yeah.
Right. Then how about, when these new projects are gonna come in, how about the ecological impact of this project? For example, cockatoos being endangered by lithium mining in South Australia.
Yeah.
So when somebody comes up with a project of lithium mining or some critical mineral mining, which is, as we speak, are on the way, does those companies need to measure their ecological health impact and those things? Because we, in these endeavor of, future made in Australia, I'm afraid that whether we are going to make the same mistake that we made when we introduced coal mining in our regions.
Yeah, I mean, trade-offs are hard, right? I think about 5 years ago, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he was very against mining, if I remember correctly. Hopefully I'm not misquoting him, but he has then come out in the last couple of years and said, if we're gonna electrify the global economy, we need mining. So, those trade-offs are hard. They're hard discussions. I think a couple other things that I'd probably add in there. Indigenous land rights, First Nations engagement. That's a really, that's a tough one. We saw one big corporate, find pennies on the dollar for, totally destroying or totally violating meaningful engagement of First Nations communities in their mining practices. So, but on the other hand, we see some companies, electrifying their entire industrial workforce, or their industrial workforce, but yeah.
But just in the news today, Gina Reinhardt's, one of her lines is 93% decarbonized.
Yeah,
Not an advocate, just saying.
yeah.
And it was faster than they thought they'd get there, and
Faster doing something.
well, they're electrifying haul trucks.
That's why I don't want to, I think I want to also, I went to an event where a startup where they want to do electrified rubbish trucks. And that was another event.
I'm sick of waking up at 6 o'clock in the morning on Thursday.
Yeah, no, they're doing, so she's really got the trucks organised. It's just you go through a scheme, eventually all the trucks, rubbish trucks all over Australia.
Yeah,
And it's growing, and that's really good.
yeah.
But what about the mining in Papua New Guinea, which is disastrous and not talked about,
Yeah,
which is
or the
environmental
offsets.
impact statements.
Yeah, I mean,
And it's just in our back door.
yeah.
This happened just really, was it about 10 years ago? And no one, I think, was it destroyed all the rivers?
Yeah.
If my memory's correct.
It's one of the big things that I really
Sorry.
like about my job is we get to put different people at the table and have really hard discussions. So it's one of my favorite things to see how those discussions go, the different arguments that get put forth at the table. I have a pretty good idea of where I stand, but you know, I don't have full and complete knowledge, right? Like there's our business and human rights lead knows she's Katie Shavit, she's absolutely brilliant. You know, she probably knows as much about human rights and like her pinky finger than I'll probably ever know. But you know, when we get into those discussions, there's a bit of bifurcation in the UN system between human rights and environment. And I think it's important to bring those discussions together so that we can, you know, talk about mining practices, we can talk about First Nations engagement, we can talk about multilateralism in different countries, we can talk about, you know, whether global tariffs are good. Like, you know, we can have those discussions. I think a lot comes out of that, and that's because we all end up working together rather than separately. And I know it's a bit cliche, but you know, we're not going to get that far fighting amongst ourselves.
Thank you very much for the answer.
Oh, I've got another question. Just about this issues of these arguments about climate adaptation. That we, and I suppose it's that maybe tension between biodiversity and climate. Obviously they're incredibly linked, but there's arguments that in Australia, for example, we shouldn't be worrying about energy as much as the environment and preserving the environment and natural environments that we have, because that's actually the limited resource that we have. So I suppose it's like, don't worry about made in Australia, and don't worry about, you know, about power lines and distribution networks. We just need to preserve the environment for future generations, and everything else has to, you know, come from that.
Yeah, I think, you know, Rain Vandenberg, who used to be the CFO of Foraco, now she's with Capitalist Coalition and Value Australia, at our conference a little while ago said, you know, climate's a big part of our nature problem. And I think sometimes of those competing interests, right, we tend to bifurcate climate nature as two separate issues, right? But last year at the, you know, in Berlin, I was shocked. Almost every single pavilion, understandably in the Amazon, it was very, very focused on, you know, nature-based solutions, different things that we can feed into the environment. We have some awesome policies here. We're one of the few biodiverse countries in the world. So if we're looking at nature, we have a lot of opportunity, even though we haven't had probably the best historical engagement with nature, like good nature practices, nature positive practices from businesses. We have a real opportunity to do some good things here on the nature side. I think the trick is not separating those conversations, because it is a complex problem, right? And there are a number of other issues. We bring them all together. So,
but that conflates things as well. When the Nature Conservancy gets pulled up for creating carbon credits for a forest in America that was never going to be cut down, I mean, it's everywhere.
Yeah,
because we're always trying to be tricky with the accounting.
Was that for whitewashing?
Let's call it.
I gotta get your card after so you can school me on the importance of carbon markets, because I would love to get past kind of the political kryptonite that, you know.
Oh, it's fair.
that carbon markets involved.
Just keep it simple, stupid. It's a commodity. Don't be afraid.
Yeah.
Barrel of oil, troy ounce of gold. We're really comfortable trading all sorts of stuff.
Yeah.
It just shouldn't be that hard. I mean, the accounting's hard, but we had it all sorted.
Yeah, but to quote Ray, if you could do accounting, you could do carbon accounting, you could do nature accounting.
Well, the
The
big
county.
four were after my company.
Yeah.
We can count that too. No idea.
Yeah, so
So that's
if
another.
we had a carbon market,
Hmm.
then these things would have been taken care of. However, when you are talking about those, greed, national greed, and why do we invest on? If you only look at electricity market, then I would say that, our national grid is old, and investing on it anymore doesn't help. It's not what. While we have got new, microgrid electricity systems, so it's more. We should go into more decentralized system and more indigenous system of doing things. For example, we have got a flagship MBA program at DP, and we ranked 7th in the world and number 1 in Australia. So our MBA director, which is based in our business school, our MBA director is a First Nation. Our First Nation person. So we used to have a very basic fundamental economics unit, and he wanted to completely change it into a sustainability and so Paul came to me with our great macros that why don't you introduce a unit of that? And I'm talking about, it's 2024. So it took me 6 months to develop a unit, and that unit is Ameeta was saying, creating value for sustainable business practice. So for that, and what I offered is, okay, now I'm gonna I'm gonna not focus on the supply demand market. I'm gonna start with carbon pricing and move into environmental valuation. That unit is gonna teach environmental cost. Okay, so when I did environmental valuation, then I came to know that our First Nation people has got some practices of valuing, those planned bushfire that we do. They call it cultural burning. So already it's built in, and so I spend a lot of time with our First Nation people in New South Wales on 2 things. One is that one, cultural burning, because there is a mathematical process of that how much you need that tree to grow and then burn it to sustainably use it. Australia has been doing it for ages. Otherwise, we would have, trees everywhere. And that actually, and which I've worked with them, researched with them, and came up with learning that the way they did it, that's very much consistent with what we teach about forest management, number 1. Okay, and I have another case study I've developed them is fishing by our indigenous people. And the fishing management, theory that we have got, that's very much consistent with what they have been to practice. So what I'm trying to say is, when we are looking at those energy transition, energy problems, it doesn't always have to be national. Our indigenous knowledge has got a lot of things in that which we have forgotten on the way. So we need to go back to those indigenous, very basic solutions of a problem rather than bringing in some new jargons, new way of and imposing things on. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. And thank you, Evan. I think that's all we have time for today. So thank you so much for coming. I've kept all my questions to ask you later. I didn't get the time because there were so many interesting questions here. But I really appreciate you coming here, and Ameeta as well. I know how busy you are.
Thanks.
Most thank you for organizing it.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you
We have to always thank you.
for Emma and Andrea. And
Yes.
Ameeta for facilitating
They bring in so many different
perspectives.
perspectives.
Yeah. And Evan is awesome as always. I met Evan when he was a staff member at Deakin University.
Yeah. It was a different lifetime ago. Yeah.
Well, yeah, 8-9 years ago. I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.
Now I'm off to a meeting with the head of data centers at AV